So let's review some of the techniques that we have available to us for starting off models. Depending, as we said in the last video, what kind of an object you want to make, you will start in many different ways. We're going to look at some of the ways of working with 2D shapes to start with and turning them into 3D objects. The most basic of this is an extrude. If I take a line, I'm just going to maximize the front window there, Alt-W, take a line, I'm going to click and draw a basic shape. Okay, I can go back into that shape and play around with the structure of it. And I can make my Bezier points from Bezier to Bezier corner, allowing me to reposition the shape, etc. And I am now going to make this a 3D object. So if I put on the extrude modifier and have a look in my perspective view, we've extruded our 2D shape. We can adjust the thickness, the number of segments, etc. And straight off you'll probably notice that this has nice quad mesh on the extruded side, but we end up with very large n-gons, that's polygons with more than 4 sides in the center. And that becomes a problem when we want to deform this in further ways. So let's put an edit poly modifier on top of the whole thing, take a vertex or two, and I try moving these in different ways, and that's kind of okay, but it becomes a bit nasty after a while. So the edit poly modifier, because the mesh was including n-gons, is giving us a little bit of trouble. Another way to view that would be if I were to put on an open subdiv on top of the shape. Our turbo smooth would have the same effect, and we do that. It's distorting badly. The reason being, open subdiv likes to work with quad geometry. So one way of working around that would be to put on a quadify mesh. So I'm going to go underneath the edit poly here, and I'm going to put on a quadify mesh modifier, and depending on the quad size I can increase this, let's say, to 8%. I can change the quad size. Now what this does, it will take that existing n-gon or polygon with more than 4 corners, and it will try and divide it up into quads and triangles. And that's fine for a lot of purposes, but you'll also see that it's not giving us kind of irregular meshes in places. So even if I were to let's delete the edit poly, it's not perfect. What it can allow you to do is to go and put an edit poly modifier on top of it now, and if we start distorting, I'm just going to grab some verts here, and it will distort more elastically. If I go to my edit poly soft selection, turn that on, I can extend the fall off. So now I can start pulling and pushing, and I've got something much more pliable, flexible, and deformable. So even though it's not a perfect geometry, it may be sufficient for the purposes that I'm using. I can also, on top of this, now that we've used the quadify mesh, I can use open subdiv, and I will get a more pleasing result in terms of the deformation. So that's using an extrude modifier. Let's look at some of the other alternatives. We've looked in the past at lathed objects. So if we take a look at this object here, this object was created using lathing, and you can see it comes by orbiting around a central axis, and it's a very useful way for creating a lot of mechanical parts or circular shaped objects that can be deformed afterwards. So what we're going to do with the lathed object here, we're just going to go through the process again. I'm going to go to the front view. I'm going to draw a line. Let's just draw something like this. And I'm going to sweep it around the central profile. So if I go to modify, L for lathe, try that again, modify, L for lathe. Now I need in this case to move the pivot around which it's rotating. So if I go to the lathe axis, in this case I want to move it across here. So this is going to lathe around the central axis that is defined by the part that I'm moving here. So this is a way of creating basically interesting shapes quite quickly. One of the things we can do with the lathe is we can go back down to sub-object mode, we can turn on our show end result, and we can make adjustments and see the results as we go. So by adjusting these, you can see it's a very quick and easy way of creating basic shapes. So with the lathe, you'll see that it's producing a nice mesh of quads, which means that we can smooth it afterwards with open subdiv, and we can also extrude and adjust polygons as an edit poly. So let's just look at what else we can do here. Let's go in here and give it some thickness. So I go above the lathe and I'm going to put on a shell modifier. Let's just turn off the first there. So I have a shell modifier, and depending on the thickness that I set for the shell, I can give it more or less thickness. And I can still go back down in and edit my geometry here. So let's say I go back to the segment. I'm going to select this segment right here on the side, and let's say I want to refine it a bit, so I'm going to go right click, refine, put in a few more points, switch to move, and do something like this. You'll see I've just created another bevel in the inside of the object. So it's a very flexible way of working, and when we have the basic shape set up, we can then go above the shell modifier, throw on an edit poly modifier, and let's do some work on this. So let's just select some polygons, extrude, extrude, say scale. So as edit poly now, we can let's go on top of the edit poly, and we're adding on an open subdiv, and we've got something that has more of a rounded shape. So very, very flexible way of creating a lot of basic shapes.